The Chernobyl exclusion zone was vast, eerie and silent. For the group of stalkers, Anton, Oleg, Dima and Irina, it was also irresistible. Stories of strange sights, abandoned relics, and the lingering mystery of Soviet experiments made the zone their ultimate target. They knew the risks, from radiation to territorial guards, but they had done their research. They were prepared, or so they thought. On the third day of their expedition, deep in the woods, they stumbled upon an abandoned village. The houses were skeletal, their wooden frames rotting and sagging. The wind howled through broken windows, carrying a faint metallic tang. In the largest house, they found a trapdoor leading to a hidden bunker. Excitement replaced caution as they descended into the darkness, their flashlights illuminating rusted shelves filled with Soviet-era relics. Among the artifacts was a sealed metal box. Inside were stacks of undeveloped film canisters, their labels written in faded Cyrillic. "Military experiment records," Irina read aloud, her voice tinged with excitement. They decided to take the canisters with them, planning to develop the film back at their makeshift camp. By nightfall, they had set up near the ruins of an old school, the forest pressing close. Anton rigged a portable projector to display the developed film on a crumbling wall. As the reels began to play, the group fell silent. The footage was grainy and erratic, showing soldiers in gas masks leading what appeared to be test subjects, ordinary people, into darkened rooms. The next reel was more disturbing. Distorted humanoid figures standing in shadows, their faces blurred or entirely absent. In several frames, the shadows seemed to move independently, creeping closer to the camera. "This is insane," Oleg muttered, shifting uncomfortably. What were they doing here? Irina rewound the reel, pausing on a frame that showed a soldier pointing at a shadowy figure. "It's not just experiments," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's like they were hunting something." The last reel was different. It wasn't filmed in a lab but outside, in a forest, strikingly similar to the one they were in now. The camera panned over a group of men, tense and armed. In the background, shadows moved unnaturally, too fast for any living creature. The footage ended abruptly as the camera fell to the ground, capturing only blurred movements and muffled screams. "Turn it off," Dima said, his voice sharp. "This isn't worth it." Anton hesitated, then powered down the projector. The group sat in uneasy silence, the distant rustling of leaves suddenly deafening. "It's just film," Anton said, trying to sound confident. "Probably staged, Soviet propaganda." But none of them could shake the feeling that they were being watched. Later that night, Irina woke to a faint rustling outside the tent. She froze, her heart pounding. The sound was steady, deliberate, like footsteps circling the camp. She nudged Anton awake. "There's something out there." Anton grabbed his flashlight and unzipped the tent, just enough to peer out. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees. "Probably an animal," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. The next morning, they found strange marks on the ground, elongated impressions, almost like clawed feet, leading toward the forest. Oleg laughed nervously. "Wild boars, maybe?" No one responded. That evening, as dusk fell, they decided to move camp closer to the village for safety. The forest grew darker, the air thicker. They set up quickly, each person keeping their weapons close. The unease grew as shadows seemed to lengthen, stretching unnaturally toward the campfire. Then the whispers began. At first, they thought it was the wind, but the voices were unmistakable, low and guttural. Anton shone his flashlight into the woods, the beam catching a fleeting figure, a shadow darting between trees, too fast to be human. "We're not alone," he said, his voice shaking. The whispers grew louder, closer. Shadows began to emerge from the darkness, humanoid yet featureless, their movements erratic and disjointed. Irina fired her rifle, the gunshot shattering the night. One of the figures dissolved into the ground like smoke, but more took its place. "Run!" Anton shouted. The group scattered, each person sprinting into the woods. Irina's flashlight flickered, casting fleeting glimpses of twisted, moving shapes. She tripped over a root, falling hard. When she looked up, One of the figures loomed over her. Its face, or lack thereof, was a void, pulling her into its suffocating darkness. Anton and Oleg regrouped near an old barn, panting and clutching their weapons. "Where's Irina? Dima?" Oleg asked, his voice breaking. Anton shook his head, too terrified to speak. The whispers surrounded them, closing in. By morning, the camp was silent. The only sign of the group was the projector, left running in the village. It displayed the final reel of film, looping endlessly. A soldier pointing at a shadowy figure, the darkness creeping closer. Victor's evenings were quiet. His small apartment hummed with the soft static of his radio equipment, where he scanned the airwaves for faint, forgotten signals. One cold winter night, his receiver caught something strange. Amid the crackle of static came numbers, spoken in a monotone voice, followed by a low hum, mechanical and eerie. Adjusting the frequency, he caught the end of the transmission, a distorted whisper saying, "Chernobyl." His hands trembled as he jotted down the numbers, coordinates. They pointed to Reactor 4, ground zero of the 1986 disaster. Curiosity overwhelmed caution. Packing his gear and a Geiger counter, Victor headed for the exclusion zone. At the perimeter fence, the frozen air was unnaturally still. A contact had granted him access, warning him to avoid Reactor 4. Yet as he walked through the desolate landscape of Pripyat, the signal in his earpiece grew stronger. His Geiger counter clicked steadily, the radiation levels rising. Ignoring the danger, Victor entered the reactor through a rusted service door. Inside, the air was stifling, laced with decay. He followed the hum down crumbling hallways, reaching a control room. Amid the dust and debris, a tape recorder sat on a desk, its reels spinning. The same signal he'd heard earlier emanated from it. As he reached for the machine, a loud clatter echoed from the hallway. He froze. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. He spun around, flashlight cutting through the shadows. A figure stumbled into view, hunched and misshapen. Its blistered, translucent skin clung to twisted bones, and its milky eyes tracked Victor's every move. "Help!" the man rasped, his voice brittle. "Stop! The signal!" Victor backed away, tripping over a chair as the man collapsed, convulsing violently. Moments later, he was still. The Geiger counter screamed as the hum from the tape recorder grew louder. Victor shut it off, but the sound didn't stop. It vibrated through the walls, shaking the floor. Searching the control panel, Victor found a compartment stuffed with faded documents. Flipping through the brittle pages, he pieced together a horrifying truth. Decades earlier, Soviet scientists had created a device to suppress radiation, called the emitter. Instead of neutralizing radiation, the low-frequency signal mutated organic tissue, twisting victims into grotesque forms. The project had been buried after the reactor explosion, but the emitter remained active. The hum intensified, resonating in Victor's chest. He bolted from the room, the twisted corridors disorienting him. The Geiger counter's frantic clicks urged him forward until he finally emerged into the frigid air outside. But even there, the hum persisted, faint but unmistakable. Back in his apartment days later, Victor destroyed his radio equipment, desperate to escape the signal. Yet one night, as he lay in bed, the hum returned. It vibrated through the walls, accompanied by distorted whispers. His skin itched and blistered, and when he looked in the mirror, he saw his reflection twist, his body warping into the very nightmare he had uncovered. The signal had found him. Yuri was no stranger to the exclusion zone. For years, he had scavenged the abandoned ruins of Pripyat, navigating its irradiated alleys and crumbling buildings for items of value. It was a dangerous life, but the thrill of discovery and the hefty payouts made it worth it. Besides, he had no family, no ties to the world outside the zone. Here, he felt strangely at home. That night, Yuri camped in the shadow of a decrepit apartment block. The air was eerily still, the only sounds the occasional creak of rusted metal and the distant howl of wind through the empty streets. He sat by a dim lantern, flipping through a notebook of hastily drawn maps, marking areas to explore the next day. Then he heard it. Faint but distinct. The shrill metallic ring of a payphone. He froze, ears straining to confirm what he thought he'd heard. The sound came again, echoing through the silent city. His brow furrowed. Payphones hadn't worked in Pripyat for decades, their wires long corroded or scavenged. He grabbed his flashlight, strapped on his mask, and set off toward the sound. The ringing led him to Lenin Square, where a single payphone stood in the shadow of a crumbling building. The phone, its once bright yellow paint now faded and peeling, sat unnervingly intact. The receiver dangled from its cord, swinging gently as if recently touched. The ringing stopped as Yuri approached, the silence louder than any noise. Slowly he picked up the receiver. "Hello?" he asked, his voice muffled through his mask. At first there was only static. Then a voice crackled through, distorted but unmistakably human. "Yuri," it whispered, his name stretching unnaturally long. "You shouldn't have come back." His breath hitched. "Who is this?" he demanded, his grip tightening on the receiver. "Do you remember the tunnels?" the voice rasped. "We're still here." The line went dead. Yuri stood frozen, heart pounding. The tunnels. Memories he had tried to bury clawed their way to the surface. His first expedition to the zone years ago, when he and a group of rookies had discovered a network of underground passages beneath Pripyat. Only he had made it out alive. The others. He had never spoken of what happened to the others. The phone began ringing again, louder this time. He dropped the receiver and backed away, but the sound followed him, echoing through the square. He turned and ran, the ringing chasing him down the darkened streets. He didn't stop until he was back at his camp. Slamming the door of the apartment block behind him, he leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. He pulled out his Geiger counter and scanned the area. Normal levels, nothing unusual. But when he turned to his maps, he found one marked with an X he hadn't drawn. It pointed to the maintenance entrance of the tunnels. "No," he muttered to himself, "I'm not going back." But he couldn't shake the feeling that the phone's call wasn't over. As the hours dragged on, a faint hum filled the air, growing louder with every passing minute. He covered his ears, but the sound vibrated in his chest, drawing him to the tunnels as if pulled by invisible strings. At dawn, Yuri stood at the rusted hatch leading underground. His flashlight barely cut through the oppressive darkness as he descended the ladder. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the faint stench of decay. The hum grew louder, reverberating through the walls. Deeper he went, following a trail of strange markings on the floor, scratches that looked almost deliberate. Finally, he reached a cavernous chamber filled with ancient machinery. At its centre stood a tangle of cables and wires, pulsating faintly, as though alive. The hum stopped. In the sudden silence, Yuri felt the hairs on his neck rise. From the shadows, something moved. A figure stepped forward, its silhouette human yet wrong. Its skin was pale and stretched, its limbs unnaturally elongated, as if warped by years of radiation. Its eyes were milky white, but they locked onto Yuri with unsettling precision. "We waited," it said, its voice the same as the one on the phone. Yuri stumbled back. "What are you?" "We were left here," it rasped. "Forgotten. But we adapted." The cables behind the creature shifted, slithering like snakes. The realization hit Yuri like a punch. The figure wasn't alone. Others emerged from the darkness, their bodies fused with the wires, their movements jerky but purposeful. Yuri turned and ran, his flashlight flickering wildly. He could hear them behind him, their voices blending with the hum that now filled the tunnels. "You can't leave," they whispered. "You're part of us now." He scrambled up the ladder and slammed the hatch shut. The hum stopped, leaving only the sound of his ragged breathing. But as he stumbled into the daylight, he heard it again, the shrill ring of a payphone, louder than before. And this time, it was coming from his camp. Anton was no stranger to the eerie silence of Pripyat. As a seasoned stalker, he had braved countless forays into the exclusion zone, scavenging for artifacts to sell to collectors obsessed with Chernobyl's grim history. but this time was different. His destination was the hospital, a place he had always avoided. The hospital loomed before him, its facade crumbling but still menacing. The shattered windows gaped like blackened eyes, and the air around the building felt heavier. Rumours had always swirled about the horrors inside, the rushed evacuations, the contaminated workers left behind, and the unexplained disappearances of those who dared to enter. But Anton couldn't resist the lure of potential treasure. He pushed open the rusted doors, his Geiger counter clicking softly as he stepped inside. The lobby was a wasteland of overturned chairs, broken glass, and decaying medical equipment. The air was stale, carrying the faint metallic scent of blood and chemicals. Anton adjusted his mask and flicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. He began his search methodically, moving from one room to the next. Most of what he found was useless: shattered vials, mouldy documents, and rusted tools. Then, in a back office, he stumbled upon a blood-stained ledger tucked inside a drawer. Its cover was embossed with the hospital's insignia, and inside were neatly written patient records. The entries were mundane at first: names, injuries, treatments. But as he flipped through the pages, the tone changed. The final entries, dated just days before the reactor explosion, mentioned patients admitted with severe radiation burns. One name caught his eye: unidentified worker number 14. The notes were sparse, but one line sent a chill down his spine. Transferred to basement ward 6. Do not open, per doctor. Volkov Anton's brow furrowed. The basement wasn't marked on the maps he'd studied. Intrigued, he left the office and began searching for an access point. After nearly an hour of combing the building, he found a door partially concealed behind a toppled filing cabinet. It was heavy, rusted, and adorned with faded biohazard warnings. His Geiger counter ticked faster as he pried it open. The basement was colder, the walls slick with condensation. Pipes snaked along the ceiling, dripping water that echoed through the narrow corridors. The air felt thicker, oppressive. Anton's flashlight flickered as he followed the faint remnants of signage toward Ward 6. He found it at the end of a long hallway. The door was sealed with chains, a warning scrawled in red paint: "Do not enter." Anton hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But greed and curiosity pushed him forward. He used his bolt cutters to snap the chains, the sound reverberating ominously. The door groaned open, revealing a room shrouded in darkness. His flashlight revealed rows of hospital beds, each occupied. At first he thought the figures were corpses, but as he stepped closer, he realized they were something worse. The patients were alive, or something close to it. Their skin was pale and translucent, stretched taut over warped bones. Their eyes were sunken, their mouths slightly agape. Some had 4 lines still attached, leading to rusted stands with empty bags. Anton's Geiger counter screamed, the radiation level spiking dangerously. He stumbled back, his heart racing. Then, one of the figures moved. Its head turned slowly, milky eyes locking onto him. A guttural moan escaped its lips, a sound filled with agony and something else: rage. Another figure stirred, then another. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as though their bodies were fighting against the decay that had consumed them. Anton backed toward the door, but his foot caught on a fallen IV stand. The clang echoed through the room, and the patients began to rise. Their moans grew louder, the sound reverberating through the ward. Panicking, Anton bolted, slamming the door behind him. The hallway seemed longer than before, the walls closing in as he sprinted toward the stairs. Behind him, he heard the scraping of feet, the moans growing closer. He reached the main floor, gasping for air. His Geiger counter was still ticking wildly as he burst into the open air. He didn't stop running until he was miles from the hospital, collapsing against the side of an abandoned building. Days later, he returned to the safety of the stalker camp. He tried to tell the others about what he had seen, but they dismissed him as paranoid. Radiation exposure, they said, could cause hallucinations. But Anton knew the truth. The patients were still there, trapped in that cursed hospital. Whatever experiments the doctors had performed had twisted them into something inhuman, and now the thought haunted him. What if they weren't trapped at all? What if they were waiting for someone to open that door again? The auditorium loomed in the heart of Pripyat, its crumbling facade an eerie relic of the city's forgotten life. Dr. Elena Markova and her team of researchers approached cautiously, their Geiger counters ticking softly. They hadn't planned to visit the building, but curiosity had led them here. The doors groaned as Pavel, Elena's assistant, pushed them open. Inside, rows of decayed seats stretched toward a stage framed by tattered curtains. The air was thick, carrying a faint metallic tang. "Let's make this quick," Pavel said, his voice echoing off the walls. Elena ignored him, stepping toward the stage. Props and equipment lay scattered across it, remnants of a long-abandoned performance. She bent to examine a crumbling script, the faded text barely legible. Then they heard it. Faint singing. The melody drifted through the space, soft and childlike. The team froze, flashlight sweeping the empty room. "Is it a recording?" one of the technicians asked nervously. "There's no power here," Pavel muttered, his grip tightening on his equipment. The singing grew clearer, seeming to come from everywhere. Elena motioned toward a side door leading backstage. "Let's check it out," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The narrow hallway beyond was lined with peeling posters and broken furniture. At its centre was a dusty reel-to-reel tape recorder, its reels spinning despite the building's long-dead power supply. Pavel hesitated before reaching for the machine. As his fingers brushed the switch, the singing stopped. Silence pressed down on them like a weight. Then came the whispers. They echoed from the auditorium, low and fragmented. Eleanor turned back, her flashlight revealing shapes moving in the shadows, childlike silhouettes standing among the seats. Motionless at first, they began to step forward, their movements slow and deliberate. "Who's there?" Eleanor called out, her voice trembling. The figures didn't respond. They moved unnaturally, like shadows cast by an unseen flame. "Let's leave," Pavel whispered, grabbing her arm. But as they turned, the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the exit disappearing into darkness. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into an unintelligible cacophony. One of the technicians panicked and bolted. His flashlight flickered as he ran, the beam fading into the void. When it returned, he was gone. The team's breaths came in ragged gasps as the remaining three stumbled back toward the stage, hoping for another exit. The air grew heavier, the temperature rising unnaturally. The silhouettes multiplied, emerging from walls and floors, their hands outstretched. Elena's flashlight caught glimpses of their faces, blistered skin, hollow sockets where eyes should have been. They moved jerkily as if controlled by invisible strings. "Run!" Elena shouted. Pavel tripped and fell behind her, his scream cut short as the shadows enveloped him. She didn't look back. She and the last technician burst through a side door, collapsing into the cold night air. The city was silent, save for the faint ticking of their Geiger counters. Neither spoke as they stumbled back to their vehicle, shaken and gasping. Days later, Elena reviewed the recordings from their equipment. Most of the footage was corrupted, the audio distorted into faint static. But one frame froze her blood. A shot of the auditorium as they fled. The rows of seats were filled with silhouettes, their faces turned toward the camera. She deleted the file. Elena never returned to the zone, but the singing haunted her dreams. On quiet nights, she swore she could still hear it, a faint childlike choir calling her back. Mark first received the email late at night. The subject line read, "You've been featured." Assuming it was spam, he almost deleted it, but the sender's name caught his eye. The archivist. Curiosity got the better of him, and he opened it. Inside was a single link with no accompanying text. Against his better judgment, he clicked it. The link took him to a minimalist website, a black background with a single folder labelled Mark's Life. Mark's pulse quickened. He hovered over the folder before clicking. Inside were hundreds of video files, each named with a specific date. Some went back decades, others as recent as last week. He clicked on one dated years earlier, when he was in high school. The video showed him at the bus stop, headphones on, oblivious to the world around him. The camera followed him as he boarded the bus, zooming in on his face through the window. Mark stared at the screen, his stomach twisting. He had no memory of anyone filming him. The next file was from college, him in a coffee shop, reading a book, the camera positioned from across the street. The videos spanned every stage of his life: graduations, quiet moments at home, walks in the park. Each one was taken without his knowledge, the angles too deliberate, the focus too precise. Panic set in. He searched for the site's origin, but the URL was untraceable. He closed his laptop and paced his apartment, his thoughts racing. Who was doing this? And why? The next morning, another email arrived. The subject line read, "A fan of your work." Mark hesitated before opening it. The message was brief. "You've made so many mistakes. I've been watching. Let me help you fix them." Attached was a new video. This one was different. It showed Mark arguing with a former co-worker outside their office building, an altercation that had nearly cost him his job. The camera angle shifted, revealing the co-worker storming off. Text overlaid the screen. "You let him win. Weak." Mark slammed his laptop shut. His heart raced as he double-checked the locks on his doors and windows. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Over the next few days, the emails kept coming. Each one contained a video paired with a critique of his life choices. "Why didn't you confront her?" accompanied footage of his breakup. "You let them walk all over you," paired with a clip of him being passed over for a promotion. The archivist was cataloguing his failures, mocking him with evidence. Mark went to the police, but without a clear source for the videos, they couldn't help. Frustrated and terrified, he stopped going to work, retreating into his apartment. He installed security cameras, hoping to catch whoever was stalking him. But the emails didn't stop. One night, Mark received a live link. The title read, "Now." He clicked, his hands shaking. The feed showed his own apartment, the view from a camera he hadn't installed. The archivist was watching him in real time. Mark's throat tightened as he scanned the room, looking for the hidden lens. He ripped apart picture frames, overturned furniture, and tore through the vents, but he couldn't find anything. The live feed continued, capturing his every frantic move. The screen flickered, and a new angle appeared, this time from his bedroom. Mark froze. The camera was positioned at his desk, where he'd spent countless nights working. His chest heaved as he stared at the screen, unsure of what to do. Then the feed cut to a black screen with a single line of text. "It's time we meet." A loud knock echoed through the apartment. Mark grabbed a kitchen knife, his hands trembling. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. Silence. The knock came again, louder this time. He approached the door cautiously, knife raised. "Go away!" he shouted. He peered through the peephole but saw nothing. Gathering his courage, he flung the door open. The hallway was empty, save for a small USB drive lying on the floor. He picked it up, his palms sweating, and plugged it into his laptop. A single video file appeared, labelled "The End." Mark hesitated, then clicked. The video showed him opening the door moments earlier, the footage taken from just outside his apartment. It zoomed in on his face, capturing the fear in his eyes. Then the angle shifted to show a figure standing behind him. Mark spun around, but it was too late. A hand clamped over his mouth, dragging him backward into the darkness. The next day, Mark's apartment was empty. His laptop sat open on the desk, the screen displaying a single folder labelled Mark's Life. Jack's weekend hikes were his escape. The forest offered solitude, a break from the chaos of his city life. He loved the quiet, the way the trees muffled sound, the only interruptions coming from rustling leaves or the distant calls of birds. But this hike felt different. The trail was unfamiliar, winding deeper into a part of the woods he didn't recognize. The cabin appeared suddenly, tucked behind a dense grove of trees. Its weathered wooden walls were grey with age, and the windows were so dirty they seemed opaque. Jack hesitated, his instincts telling him to turn back, but curiosity pushed him forward. He stepped onto the creaking porch and tried the door. It was unlocked. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of damp wood and mould. The cabin's interior was surprisingly empty, save for a table, a few chairs, and shelves lining the walls. But it was what was on the shelves that made Jack's stomach churn. DVD cases, hundreds of them, each neatly labelled with a name and a date. He scanned the labels, his heart pounding when he recognised the names of people from his life. His parents, his ex-girlfriend, his college roommate. His own name appeared repeatedly, spanning decades. He picked one at random, sliding the disc into a small, dust-covered player hooked to an ancient television in the corner. The video began with a shaky shot of a playground. Jack's breath caught as he saw himself, no older than 7, chasing his friends across the monkey bars. The camera zoomed in on his face, lingering as he laughed, oblivious to the fact that he was being watched. The scene changed, showing him at 16, sitting on a park bench with his first girlfriend. The camera remained hidden, capturing moments he'd thought were private. Jack felt a chill creep up his spine. Who had taken these videos? How long had they been watching him? He pulled out another DVD, this one dated a few weeks ago. The footage showed him in his apartment, sitting on the couch, eating dinner. The angle was low, as if the camera had been hidden in his living room. He felt nauseous. Someone had been inside his home. As he rifled through the DVDs, Jack noticed a disc labelled Today. His hands trembled as he loaded it into the player. The screen flickered, and he saw himself walking through the forest just hours earlier. The camera followed from a distance, zooming in as he approached the cabin. The final shot showed him stepping inside. The video ended, leaving only static. A creak from the floorboards above broke the silence. Jack's blood ran cold. He hadn't seen a staircase, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone was upstairs. He turned toward the door, but it was already closing, the faint glow of daylight vanishing as it clicked shut. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaking. No answer. His flashlight beam swept the room, catching shadows that seemed to move. He backed toward the door, but his foot hit something on the floor. Looking down, he saw a camcorder, its red light blinking. It had been recording him. The sound of footsteps descended from above, slow and deliberate. Jack grabbed a heavy chair, gripping it tightly as the footsteps grew louder. "I know you're here," he shouted. The steps stopped just outside the doorway leading to the next room. For a moment, there was silence. Then the camera on the floor began to whir, its lens turning to focus on him. Jack's breathing quickened as he swung the flashlight toward the doorway. A man stood there, tall and gaunt, his face obscured by a black hood. In his hands was another camcorder, the lens pointed directly at Jack. "What do you want?" Jack demanded, his voice breaking. The man didn't respond. He raised the camcorder higher, the red light blinking steadily. Jack's heart pounded as he stepped back, gripping the chair like a shield. The man moved without warning, fast and silent. Jack swung the chair, but it connected with empty air. The flashlight flickered, and the man was gone. The cabin seemed to close in around him, every shadow a threat. The camcorder on the floor continued to record, its blinking light the only constant. Jack bolted for the door, yanking it open and sprinting into the woods. He didn't stop running until he reached his car, his chest heaving, his hands shaking as he started the engine. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the hooded man, but the woods were empty. Back at home, Jack called the police. By the time they reached the cabin, it was empty. The DVDs, the camcorders, even the table and shelves were gone. It was as if the place had never existed, but Jack couldn't forget. That night, as he tried to sleep, his phone buzzed. He picked it up to find an email with no subject line. The attachment was a video file. He hesitated before opening it. The footage showed his bedroom, the camera angled from the corner of the ceiling. It zoomed in on him, lying frozen in bed, his eyes wide with fear. The final frame was a message written in red text across the screen. "I'm still filming." Emma had always been cautious about her privacy. Moving into her first apartment was supposed to be a fresh start. No nosy neighbours, no roommates borrowing her things. The building wasn't fancy, but it was quiet, nestled in a neighbourhood where people kept to themselves. It seemed perfect. Her excitement turned to unease when, during her first night unpacking, she found something strange. While changing a light bulb, she noticed a small, dark lens embedded in the fixture. A camera. Her stomach dropped. She ripped it out and stared at it in disbelief. Who would put a camera here? She told herself it was left over from a previous tenant, a prank or some sort of sick joke. Still, she called the landlord. "It's nothing to worry about," he said dismissively. "Kids these days think it's funny to spy on each other. I'll have maintenance check the rest of the place." Unsatisfied but too tired to argue, Emma decided to let it go. The next day, she carried on unpacking, trying to shake the nagging feeling that she wasn't alone. She covered the windows with thick curtains and started checking every corner for hidden cameras. She didn't find any more, but the sense of violation lingered. A week later, a package arrived. There was no return address. Inside was a USB drive and a note. "You've been my favourite project." Her hands trembled as she plugged the drive into her laptop. The first file was labelled Day 1. It showed Emma walking into her new apartment, the footage taken from an angle high above. She felt a chill. This was from the camera in the light fixture. The next clip showed her unpacking boxes, humming to herself, unaware she was being watched. Each video documented her daily routine, brushing her teeth, making coffee, lounging on the couch. By the time she finished watching, her breath was shallow, her heart racing. Someone had been spying on her, and they wanted her to know. She called the police, who took the footage seriously, but found no leads. "It's likely an ex-boyfriend or someone you know," one officer suggested. But Emma had no history of stalkers or abusive relationships. She changed her locks and installed her own cameras. For a while, things seemed to return to normal. Then another package arrived. This one contained a single photograph. It was her, as a child, playing in her backyard. Emma's heart stopped. She recognized the house immediately. It was her childhood home, and the photo was taken from behind the bushes. She turned it over. Written on the back were the words, "Since the beginning." Emma's mind raced. Who had been following her all this time? She called her mother, desperate for answers. "Did you ever notice anything strange when I was growing up? Someone watching us?" Her mother hesitated. "Well, there was that one neighbour, Mr. Klein. He always seemed interested in you, but he moved away years ago." Emma couldn't sleep that night. Every noise made her jump, every shadow seemed to move. The next day she searched online for Mr. Klein, but there was no trace of him, no address, no death record, nothing. Another package arrived. This time, it was a collection of DVDs. She hesitated, but curiosity won out. The first video showed her college dorm room, footage taken from hidden cameras. The second was from her childhood bedroom, her teenage self scribbling in a diary. Each clip was more invasive than the last, showing moments Emma hadn't even remembered. The final DVD was labelled Tomorrow. Emma pressed play. It showed her, sitting at her kitchen table, exactly as she was now. The video continued, showing her getting up to answer the door. A man stepped inside, his face obscured by shadows, and she froze as he moved closer to her on the screen. A knock came at the door. Emma's body went cold. The knock came again, louder this time. She backed away, grabbing her phone. Before she could dial, a voice called through the door. "Emma, it's the police. We received a tip about suspicious activity at your apartment." Relief flooded her. She opened the door a crack, but the man on the other side wasn't in uniform. He smiled, his teeth yellowed and uneven. "Gotcha," he whispered, shoving the door open. The phone clattered to the floor as Emma tried to fight him off. He pinned her down, murmuring about how long he'd waited for this moment. "You've been the perfect subject," he said, his breath hot against her ear. "But every project needs an ending." The next day, the police found her apartment empty. The only clue was a USB drive left on the counter. It contained a single file, Final Cut. In it, Emma sat in a chair, her eyes wide with terror as the man stood behind her, holding the camera. The video ended abruptly, the screen cutting to black. David hadn't set foot in his parents' attic in years. The dusty, cramped space was full of old boxes and forgotten belongings, each coated in a layer of neglect. After his father's passing, the responsibility of clearing out the house fell to him. As he sorted through photo albums and childhood toys, one box stood out. It was labelled in black marker, "For your eyes only." Curious, David pried it open. Inside were dozens of VHS tapes, their labels scrawled with dates spanning decades. Some were from his early childhood, others as recent as last year. His brow furrowed. He couldn't remember his family owning a camcorder, let alone making so many tapes. That evening, David set up his old VCR. The first tape was innocuous enough. Him as a toddler playing in the backyard. His mother's voice could be heard laughing, coaxing him to take a few wobbly steps. He smiled, nostalgia washing over him. But the next tape unsettled him. It was footage of him alone in his room. No other voices, no obvious cameraman. The camera lingered on his sleeping form, the lens zooming in, as if the person behind it wanted to memorize every detail of his face. David turned off the tape, his heart pounding. Was this a prank? He checked the box again. The dates were sequential, covering years of his life. He played another tape, this one labelled "First Day of School." It wasn't a proud parent's view of their child boarding the bus. Instead, the camera watched from across the street, hidden behind bushes. It followed him walking with his backpack, glancing nervously at other kids. The realization hit him like a punch. These tapes weren't made by his family. Someone had been following him for decades. Each tape he played revealed more chilling footage. His soccer games, his high school prom, even quiet moments in his room where he thought he was alone. Whoever made these tapes had access to places they never should have. David's mind raced. How had they entered his home? Who could have been this close without anyone noticing? Then he found the last tape. Its label read simply, "Now." His hands trembled as he slid it into the VCR. The screen flickered to life, showing a static shot of his living room, his current living room. The camera was positioned at an angle he recognized immediately. It was from the corner near the bookshelf. On the screen, he saw himself earlier that day, sorting through the attic boxes. The camera zoomed in slowly as he found the tapes, lingering on his confused expression. David's breath quickened. The footage jumped, showing him now, sitting in front of the television, the glow of the screen illuminating his pale face. His eyes darted to the corner of the room, but it was empty. The camera's perspective didn't match reality. It was as if the tape was still being recorded. Suddenly, a new sound crackled from the television. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate, they echoed, not from the tape but from behind him. David froze. The floorboards creaked, the sound closing in. He reached for his phone but knocked it to the floor in his panic. His eyes darted to the dark hallway behind him, his heart pounding. "David!" A voice rasped, low and hoarse. He turned, his eyes locking on the shadowy figure standing just beyond the doorway. The man was gaunt, his face obscured by the dim light, but the lens of a camcorder glinted in his hands. The red recording light blinked steadily. David backed away, his legs trembling. "Who are you?" he managed to choke out. The man stepped closer, raising the camcorder to his face. He didn't answer, but his voice came from the TV instead. "I've always been here." The lights flickered, and David bolted for the front door. It wouldn't budge. He fumbled with the lock, his hands slick with sweat. Behind him, the camera's whirring grew louder, drowning out his panicked breathing. When the police arrived hours later, the house was empty. The box of tapes sat neatly on the coffee table, and the TV was off. David was gone, his car still in the driveway. In the corner of the living room, mounted on a tripod, was a camcorder. Its tape was labelled simply, Finale. Lauren loved her new neighbourhood. After years of moving between cramped city apartments, her suburban house felt like a dream. It was cosy, with big windows overlooking a quiet street. Her neighbours were friendly, but not overly intrusive, giving her the perfect balance of community and privacy. Privacy. She thought about that word often as she stood in front of her living room window, sipping coffee and watching the world go by. Across the street was a house she hadn't seen anyone enter or leave. Its curtains were always drawn, the porch covered in dead leaves. The neighbours claimed it had been vacant for years, though Lauren often thought she saw movement through the windows. Just the flicker of a shadow or a sudden shift in the curtains. One evening, as she sat reading in her living room, she felt it again. The sensation of being watched. Her eyes drifted to the house across the street. In one of the windows, a faint glow flickered. A television, maybe. She squinted, but the light disappeared. Shrugging it off, she returned to her book. The next morning, a package sat on her porch. There was no label, no return address. Inside was a USB drive. Lauren hesitated before plugging it into her laptop. The drive contained a single video file titled, For Lauren. Her stomach tightened as the video began. It showed her, sitting in her living room the night before, reading her book. The angle was from above, as if someone had been filming from the ceiling. She froze, her breath catching. The footage shifted to show her brushing her teeth in the bathroom, then sleeping in her bed, the camera positioned near her window. Lauren slammed her laptop shut, her hands shaking. Someone had been in her house, or close enough to see into it. She dialed the police, but their investigation turned up nothing. The locks hadn't been tampered with, and there were no signs of forced entry. Probably a prank, one officer said dismissively. That night, Lauren closed every curtain and double-checked all the locks. She slept with a heavy flashlight beside her bed. But as the hours ticked by, her fear grew. Around midnight, she heard it, a faint tapping on the glass. She bolted upright, gripping the flashlight tightly. The sound came again, deliberate and steady. She crept to the window, heart pounding. Peering through the curtains, she saw nothing but the empty street. Her eyes shifted to the house across the street. A faint light flickered in the same window as before. She could have sworn she saw a figure standing there, motionless. The next day, Lauren decided she couldn't take it anymore. She needed answers. Crossing the street, she knocked on the door of the vacant house. No one answered, but the door creaked open under her touch. Inside, the air was heavy with dust, the faint scent of mildew lingering. The furniture was covered with sheets, and cobwebs clung to the corners. She found herself drawn to the room with the flickering light. As she entered, the first thing she saw was the wall, a wall of screens. They displayed live footage from inside her house, her living room, her bedroom, her kitchen. Her blood ran cold. She approached the screens, her hands trembling. Beneath them was a table stacked with hard drives, labelled with dates stretching back years. Lauren's breath caught when she recognised herself in one of the videos. It was from her old apartment, footage of her cooking dinner, singing along to the radio. Another screen showed her college dorm room, and another, her childhood home. She stumbled back, bile rising in her throat. Someone had been watching her for decades. A noise behind her made her spin around. A man stood in the doorway, his face obscured by shadows. He wore a mask, a blank, expressionless face painted white. "You weren't supposed to see this," he said, his voice low and even. Lauren bolted for the door, her feet slipping on the dusty floor. The man moved quickly, blocking her path. "Don't make this difficult," he said, advancing. Lauren grabbed a lamp from the table and swung it, the glass shattering as it struck his arm. He stumbled, giving her just enough time to escape. She ran into the street, screaming for help. Lights flicked on in the neighbouring houses, and the man retreated into the darkness. When the police arrived, the house was empty. The screens were gone, the hard drives missing. It was as if the room had never existed. Lauren couldn't sleep for weeks, her every move haunted by the knowledge that someone was still watching. Then one morning, another package arrived on her porch. Inside was a photograph of her, taken from across the street. On the back, a single line was scrawled in red ink. "I'm still here."